we are going to be in Matthew chapter 9 today. Matthew chapter 9. And the title of today's message is that Jesus makes all things new. And so just like he made that new covenant that we are just reading about in Hebrews, he makes everything new. And that's what we're going to be talking about here today in Matthew chapter 9, starting in verse 14 today. Curiosity is, how many of you have ever restored an old car? Do you have any? A few of you? All right, wonderful. How many of you have restored old furniture? Okay, a few more. Oftentimes, our culture today, we kind of like to go back into the days of yesteryear and go back into, we try to restore things back to their original glory. But if you were to go online and try to buy something that has been restored, or like me, I'm always buying books and things like that, and used books or something like that, and oftentimes it doesn't actually say, you can't say that it's brand new, right? If you restore a 50-year-old car, you can't say that it's brand new, but rather you say it's like new. And that's the limit that we have here in our human capabilities. We can't ever really make something brand new ever again, because after it gets out of that parking lot, after it goes out of the book, out of the packaging where we break it, it's no longer new, and there's nothing we can do about it. We can keep it in good shape. We can try our best, but we can't ever make it new. But Jesus can. And we're going to be looking at that on ways that he makes things new, what he makes new here today. So if you have your Bibles, Matthew chapter 9, starting in verse 14. And the first point that we're actually going to get to right off the bat here is that Jesus made a new covenant. Jesus made a new covenant. That is in your bulletins. One of the blanks is the word covenant. Let's go ahead and start reading in Matthew chapter 14. Then the disciples of John came to him, saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" All right, so we will stop there. So it says that the disciples of John, right? This is, if you haven't been here the last few weeks, Jesus has been going around and just really performing miracle after miracle after miracle. And last week we looked at how he performed the miracle of healing the paralytic man that they lowered down and through the roof. And then he called one of the sinners, Matthew, to be one of his disciples. And he went out and he had dinner with all the worst people in the city. But he was there ministering to them. And so now the disciples of John, this is obviously John the Baptist, come up to Jesus and say, "Hey, Jesus, why are we fasting? Why do the Pharisees fast, but none of you guys are fasting here?" See, because the Pharisees, they were the religious leaders of that day, and John the Baptist, his followers were extremely devout. And so the Orthodox Jewish people, the religious people of that day, would usually fast twice a week. And coincidentally, or not really coincidentally at all, they would pick the days to fast based on which days there was the most people on the marketplace. And so they would wait until it was really crowded when all the people were there on the market, and then they would fast, and they'd put on robes that were torn up, and they'd put dirt on their face and say, "Oh dear, I can't imagine. I've just been fasting for so long. I don't have strength to walk." And it's like, bro, you missed breakfast. But yet that's what they would do. And so Jesus already talked about that in the Sermon on the Mount, dealing with that. But yet even John the Baptist's disciples also were fasting, because fasting was a sign that you loved the Lord. It was a sign that you were sorry for your sins. It was a sign that you said, well, I want to do whatever I can to get close to God. And so they say, why are we having to fast twice a week? It's almost like a little kid, right? Whenever I was a child and my mom let me stay up late, and so I'd tell my friends the next day, "My mom let me stay up till 10 o'clock. It's like, well, how did you do that? It almost seems like the disciples are like, Jesus, like, why do we still gotta fast over here with John, but you guys don't? Every time we look over at Peter, he's eating a Twinkie. Like, what's going on? This isn't fair here." But Jesus gives a response. He gives a response in three different ways, three different metaphors here. Starting in verse 15. He says, "And Jesus said to them, 'Can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them?'" Stop right there. So the first illustration that he gives is of that of a wedding. So to understand this answer, we have to know a little bit about the weddings in that culture. They would get married, and then there was a 7-day long celebration. They would have the ceremony. the bride and groom would go away, and then they'd come back, and then they were responsible for throwing a 7-day-long party for all their friends and relatives and that crazy uncle that you never wanted to invite in the first place, but you still got to invite. They were there for 7 whole days, and that was a big celebration, right? Because in that time, there was no vacation plans. That people didn't just jump on a plane and go out to Europe on a vacation or anything like that. And so really, whenever there was a wedding, that was the biggest feast that these people might have all year or every few years. This was what they would look forward to. And so during that time, whenever there was a wedding, you didn't fast during that time. You celebrated, right? Because somebody else, your cousin's paying for your lunch, so I'm going to eat my lunch. I'm not going to fast during this time. And so that's what Jesus gave as the example. He says, while the bridegroom is here, the guests don't fast. They don't mourn. That bridegroom in the Old Testament is often referred to as God the Father, Yahweh. In the New Testament, Jesus often takes that term as the bridegroom of the church. And so it's very much of an allusion to the fact that he is God here. But he says that the guests are not going to mourn and they're not going to fast when I am here. Keep reading. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. I think that this most directly is talking about when the days that he actually is crucified coming up. But this teaches a little bit about fasting. Coincidentally, this is actually the 3rd time in the book of Matthew that we talked about fasting. Matthew chapter 4, whenever Jesus was tempted, he went out and he fasted for 40 days. And then in the Sermon on the Mount, he talked about hypocritical fasting that the Pharisees were doing. And then this time is the 3rd time that he talked about it, which kind of shows how important of a topic it really is, even though we don't often talk about it very often. And so this, it gives an illusion or gives kind of indication of what fasting is for. Number one, it's when you mourn. The bridegroom, the guests were mourning whenever the bridegroom is taken away. And that's the difference really between what the Pharisees saw as fasting and also what Jesus saw fasting was. See, the Pharisees and the religious people of the day that didn't have a relationship with God, they would go out and they would attempt to fast in such a way as to just make God pleased with them. To maybe even make God do what they want. And sometimes that's how we view it still today, right? Whenever we say, I'm really praying, I really hope that this would happen, and to really get my way this time, I'm going to fast. Like that, it's like you're getting on your knees, and I've done it. I'm guilty of this. Sometimes getting on my knees and almost come kind of saying to God, like, hey, God, I don't know if you noticed, but I've been fasting. I would really appreciate if you answer this prayer request and you answer it quick. I'm getting kind of hungry, almost as a way to try to twist God's arm. And the Pharisees saw it as a way to look good in front of other people, to maybe try to get to God to do what they want. But that's not how Jesus saw it. Jesus saw it as connected to mourning. He saw it connected to preparation. He saw it connected to other emotions, and that's really what fasting is. If you read through the Bible, you're going to see it's always connected to a time or a response of something bad that's happened, or an expectation of something good that's happened. It's not just a habit that you get into, but yet it's something that you do almost like you don't have any control over it. If you ever have a person that's passed away, maybe if you've ever been to the hospital and after a horrible wreck and you spend all day at the hospital and you get home after the whole day and you've been praying all day and you've been worrying all day and you've been trying to give that over to the Lord all day, and then you get home 12 hours later and say, I haven't eaten at all, right? Because that's just that natural response of you going to the Lord in those moments. And he says, that is what will happen whenever I leave. By the way, we are still in that time. Jesus obviously is here with us. He's in our hearts. But at the same time, he's not walking around the earth like he was in the New Testament. So that is an expectation that we ought to be fasting. We pray often. We come to church on a weekly basis. But how many of us actually take time out to fast? So it's kind of a two-sided coin there, saying don't just do it out of a habit to try to get to be spiritual, but at the same time, if the only time you're ever going to do it is when you have a terminal cancer diagnosis, it's not just for that either. It's for every moment that you go to the Lord and say, Lord, I want to align myself with you. I want to get closer to you. I want to learn how to rely on you better, because I'm not even going to rely on food. I'm not going to rely on substance. I'm only going to rely on you. So he gives this first example here. Then he gives 2 more examples. Verse 16. No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch tears away from the garment, and a worse tear is made. Stop right there. So here's an example here. How many of you have ever sewn a patch on a piece of clothing? Okay, good majority. Although, I don't know if anybody my age or younger actually raised their hand, right? Because if you go up to a young person today and say you have a hole in your pants, they say, I paid $75 for that hole, and right? Yeah, I'm not going to patch that. No, of course not. But for those that have patched it, you know that you would not want to stick a piece of cloth that has never been shrunk, a piece of cloth that potentially whenever you stick it in the dryer is going to shrink up, and then all of a sudden it would make the hole there even bigger, because you would sew it in a pre-shrunk fabric, an old piece of shirt, an old piece of pants, and you put a unshrunk piece of cloth. As soon as you stick it in the dryer, it's going to shrink and make that tear worse. Same thing back then. They would, whenever they would wash it, whenever they would go around in the hot sun all day, if they had a brand new patch on a hole that was on an old piece of fabric, that would just rip and tear. Let's keep reading though, and I'll come back to actually say what's important about that. Verse 17, neither is a new wine put into old wineskins. If it is, the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, so both are preserved. So he gives the last example. He says that you wouldn't put new wines in old wineskins. The wineskins of that day, they were made out of animal hide. So after you killed the animal, you take the hide and you would sew it up in such a way that you could put wine inside of it. And now whenever you'd put new wine in there and it starts to ferment, it would expand. New wineskin, because it was off the hide of an animal, it had that elastic, and so it could expand with the wine and it could hold it all. But if you got an old wineskin that was brittle and frail, as soon as the fermenting happens, it would break loose and it would spill everywhere. And so he says, don't put new wine in old wineskins. All right, so at this point you're saying, all right, I got it. Okay, don't put a new cloth on old cloth. Don't put new wine in old wineskins. This is really why I wanted to come to church. Some great knowledge here, right? What does this have to do with my life? Well, what he's saying here is an answering back to John's disciples. Whenever they were saying, why aren't your disciples fasting like we're fasting? He's saying, you are trying to do the old covenant methods, a way of trying to please the Lord, a way of trying to just check off the to-do list to make God happy. And don't take your old practices into your new relationship. It's no longer just about trying to do these certain things to make God happy, but rather it's all about this new relationship. And so that's the big idea for point number 1, is to don't bring your old practices into your new relationship. We still do this today. And the fact that we want to go back. Some of us are bringing old practices of sin into our new Christian relationship, and we shouldn't be doing that either. But many of us still, we come to God because every other relationship that we have is really kind of based on what we do, right? Our employer is happy or angry at us based on what we do for them. Some of us, unfortunately, this is how we felt about our parents too, that we could only make them happy if we did well, and they were angry if we didn't do well. And some of us, even our spouse or marriage relationships have felt like this for a very long time. And so we take that attitude into the attitude of God, where we say, well, as long as I just do the right things, I check off the right boxes, then God will be happy for us. Still around today, I saw this advertisement yesterday, and I just had to include it. Hey, Maddie, if you want to play that next video here for us.
Alexa, after church we're going to say grace.
Bless, O Lord, this food to our use, and us in your service.
Real quick commercial there. I don't know if you caught it all. So she sat down and she said, Alexa, please say grace. She had Alexa say the prayer before the meal. Whenever Jesus talks about praying always, I don't think that he was very concerned about just having a robot say the prayer for you. But yet that's how oftentimes we come to the Lord and say, well, as long as I check off the list, as long as I say the prayer, and if I don't even have time, if I'm a little bit busy, I'll have my robot do it. But yet that's how so many of us end up coming to Jesus in such a way that we say, as long as I just do the right thing, he'll be happy with me. Jesus says, no, don't bring that old practices in. It's about a relationship. Let's keep going on. To our second point here is that Jesus made people new. Jesus made people new. The next blank in your bulletin there. I'm going to read now verses 18 and following. This passage is also written in Mark chapter 5 and Luke chapter 8. Mark 5 and Luke 8. I'm not going to read through all of that because we don't have time. But if you want to get a full scope of this, I'll be referencing those stories. But if you want to go back and look at those later this afternoon, I'm sure it'd be helpful as well. Mark 5 and Luke 8 is where this story is listed. Let's keep reading. While he was saying these things to them, behold, a ruler came in and knelt before him, saying, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." Verse 19, and Jesus rose and followed him with his disciples. So as he was still talking to John the Baptist's disciples, a ruler came and knelt before him. Now in Mark and Luke's account, they clarify who that ruler was. He was actually a ruler of the synagogue, an elder of the synagogue of the city of Capernaum. Matthew doesn't mention that, right? Because Matthew is written to Jewish people, and so whenever they saw that he was a ruler, they would have just naturally assumed probably that he was the ruler of the synagogue. So he doesn't need that detail. But Mark and Luke give us that he was not only a ruler, but he was the ruler. In the synagogue, that was more or less their church. That's where they would go to read Scripture. That's where they would go to study the Word, to gather together and be discipled, just like this church building is what we use for that all these throughout the week and on Sunday. And in a similar way, just like our church, we have a board of elders. If you didn't know, that's me, Tom Marshall, Kevin Callahan, Jen Smith, and unfortunately Patty is stepping down because he's going out to Utah. But in that same way that the synagogues, they would also have a board of elders that would rule that area. And then they'd have one, they would vote on one typically, according to the practice, that would be the leader. For us, that's Jim Smith, the board of our elders. But in that time period, it was a man named Jairus. Mark and Luke give his name, Jairus. And he comes to him. Did you catch what he says? He came in, and he knelt before him, saying, "My daughter has just died." If you've been with us so far in Matthew, or if you know the Gospels, and it's really going to pick up in the next few chapters, Jesus and the religious leaders of the day were constantly butting heads. They were not best friends. The religious leaders wanted to do anything and everything they could to get rid of him, even up to the point of killing him on the cross one day. And in this city, in the city of Capernaum, where he was, there was no greater religious leader than Jairus. He was the leader of the synagogue. He was pictured that. We don't know if he's a Pharisee or scribe, but he very well could have been. But regardless, he was the very picture of what the religious establishment looked like. And they hated Jesus generally. But you see, Jairus, when his daughter was dying, had died, he was going to do whatever it takes. And he came down and he knelt down before Jesus. And it shows that he truly believed in Jesus in that moment. I think the challenge for us here is not to be in a situation that it takes that moment to come back to Jesus. So many of us, it takes this monumental, horrible thing in our life to actually come back and say, "God, I need you. I've been trying to do this all myself and I can't, and I need you." If you get to that point, it's still best to go back to Jesus. I'm not saying that, but hopefully you won't ever get to the point where you have to fall down on your knees and say, "I'm sorry, I wasn't here to begin with." But he comes down and he says, "My daughter has died." But look at his faith, though, in Jesus at this moment. He says, "But come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." This little girl is dead. Some of us have experienced that. Some of us have even experienced a funeral in this very room. And that heartache of losing a loved one. Some of us have even lost children, and that heartache, and that's what he was feeling in that moment. And so Jesus, showing compassion, verse 9, he rose and followed him with his disciples. I'm guessing that he probably got up pretty quickly. Jairus probably wanted to get back as soon as he can. This was a panic mode for Jairus, and he was so they start walking with his disciples, and they start trying to go back to his house. But wherever Jesus went, there was always crowds around him. Let's keep on reading here because there's another interaction on his way. Verse 20. And behold, once again, notice whenever he says behold, because that's what Matthew wants us to notice. It says, behold, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. For she said to herself, if only I touch his garment, I will be well. This woman sitting there. Let's see what it says about this woman. It says that she suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years. That discharge of blood literally is the word hemorrhaging from blood. Understandably, it's a female issue, bleeding in that way. And so for 12 years, she was like this. Now, the book of Mark and the book of Luke, once again, it tells a story. Both of them say that she also went to all sorts of doctors. And spent all her money. And Mark actually says she spent all her money, and then she was even worse off. She wasn't even better after seeing the doctors. Luke, who's a doctor, didn't mention that part about the doctors. But yet she had spent all her money for the last 12 years. She had no answers. She had nowhere else to turn. And so we find her here on the path as Jesus is walking. Now it says here that she suffered a discharge of blood for 12 years and came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. The fringe of his garment. That word fringe in the Greek, it's every other time really, it's translated as a tassel. If you've ever seen an Orthodox Jewish person wear a prayer shawl, that they would wear oftentimes whenever they pray, they have four little blue tassels on their shawl. And that's something that comes out of the Old Testament. In this time period, during the time of the writing of the New Testament, each and every Jewish man would have 4 tassels on his robe, little blue tassels that the Old Testament tells them that they should have. And those tassels were there to remind them to follow the Word of God. It was there to remind them that they are to remain faithful to the Word of God. And so this woman reaches out and tries to touch it. Tries to grab it, really, is what the Greek is saying. She tries to reach out and grab that tassel. Coincidentally, a lot of the Jewish people in that time period thought whenever the Messiah came that his tassels were going to be miraculous and healing. So I think it kind of gives an indication of exactly who she thought that Jesus was. So she was coming up behind him, reach out and touch the tassels. Now, once again, the tassels were down at the bottom of his robe. So she was down on the ground. As people were walking by very quickly, going to this other building, this other place to perform a miracle, and everybody's running alongside of Jesus, somehow she was probably on the ground, just reaching out, straining out, trying not to be trampled, but doing whatever she could to reach out and touch Jesus. Because what did it say in verse 21? For she said to herself, if I only touch his garment, I will be made well. A word she said to herself. It's in the imperfect in the Greek, meaning that she said it. She's like, if only I touch the garment, if only I touch the garment, if only I can touch his clothes, if only I can do that. There's another reason why that she might have only wanted to touch his garment, because of being a woman with a bleeding for 12 years, it was illegal for her to try to touch him. That would have made him unclean. In Leviticus chapter 15, if you want to, I might have to skip forward a verse there, Maddie, but Leviticus 15, 25 through 27, the Old Testament law concerning her condition. It says, if a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her menstrual impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond the time of her impurity, all the days of the discharge she shall continue in uncleanliness. As in the days of her impurity, she shall be unclean. Verse 26, every bed on which she lies, all the days of her discharge shall be as the bed of her impurity. And everything on which she sits shall be unclean, as in the uncleanliness of her menstrual impurity. And whoever touches these things shall be unclean, and shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until that evening. So not only was she's suffering from horrible disease for 12 years that she couldn't get any type of rest from, that doctors could not help for over a decade. She couldn't get any rest. At the same time, she was considered unclean, and she was separated from the rest of the people. You couldn't touch her. You couldn't interact with her. You couldn't touch the bed that she was on. You couldn't touch the clothes that she was wearing. Why? Because it was all unclean according to the Old Testament law there. And so for her, she knew that she better not touch Jesus, but maybe if I just tug on his tassel a little bit, if only I can just do that, then I might be healed. Let's keep reading here. 22. And Jesus turned, and seeing her, he said, "Take heart, daughter. Your faith has made you well." And instantly the woman was made well. Don't forget, one, that we're in the context, we're in a story of Jesus dealing with the biggest religious leader of that day in the city of Capernaum. And while going to heal his little daughter, which he was going to do, at the same time, he stopped and he healed a woman that had nothing, that was destitute, that was poor, that was outcast, that the whole world had rejected. He stopped and he healed her. He stopped and he said, in the other Gospels, it gives a little bit more detail, once again, if you want to read it. But it said that as he was walking, he probably felt a tug on his coat, and he said, "Who touched me?" And the disciples say, "What do you mean, who touched me? There's a crowd all around us. We're all touching you." And he says, "No, I felt the power go out of me." And then at that point, the woman, knowing that she could not hide herself anymore, stood up and said, "It was me. It was me." And Jesus says, "Take heart, be of good cheer. Your faith has made you well." That word, "made you well," in the Greek, is actually the word soter. It's the word that we get soteriology, or the study of salvation. So it's very appropriate as well to translate that verse, "Your faith has saved you," which is exactly what faith does. More than the physical healing, it saved her in a spiritual way as well. And he looked at her for the first time that somebody actually seen her, right? Because she was somewhere on the ground just trying to reach out and touch the fringes, touch the tassel of his garment. Nobody was paying attention to her, but Jesus noticed and he saw. I think that's an encouraging word for some of us. I don't know who you are, but you do. And you needed to hear that word. Whenever it seems like the whole world has passed you by, when you've been struggling with something for over a decade long, and you don't ever think that there's ever going to be any type of rest from that, Jesus sees and he's able to heal. But oh man, it gets good after that. All right, let's keep reading. Verse 23, and when Jesus came to the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, "Go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. All right, so he gets to Jairus' house, and there's already a flute player and the people making a commotion. Now, for us, that sounds weird, right? Because the last thing that I want to do after a family member dies, like, you know what, we need a flute. Like, that just does not ring well for me. But in that time period, whenever somebody died, they would actually go out and they would hire a flute player to play sad music. And then they would also hire at least two weepers, women that would just go around and weep audibly and weep loudly. And so everybody would know that somebody had died and that somebody cared for them. If they were rich, and he probably was, there might have even been a whole plethora of women out there just wailing and weeping. It wasn't very genuine, though, because whenever Jesus came up and said, "Hey, go away," he says, "Go away, for the girl is not dead, but she's sleeping." What did they do? They laughed at him. They laughed at him. Which I never want to be in the situation where I'm laughing at Jesus, right? Because in that moment, in my sinful self, I would have been, "Oh no, I'll show you guys. Just you wait." But Jesus is much holier than I, but he still said, "Hey, you guys got to get out of here." I think, in honesty, because they were laughing at him instead of believing on him, they missed the opportunities to see God move in a way that nobody else has ever seen before. And so for us, what is it in our life that we said, "Yeah, I've been praying about something for so long. I've been praying about my spouse. I've been praying about my family members. I've been praying about so many things in my life, and I'm just I'm tired of it. I don't think that God is ever going to heal it." Are we to the point where we want to say we're laughing at God, but we just don't believe him when he says it? And in John chapter 11, Jesus actually also raises up Lazarus from the dead. And in that moment, he says as well, he's like, hey, basically, to paraphrase, he says, it's time to go see Lazarus because he's sleeping. And his disciples come back and say, but Jesus, if he's sleeping, he'll wake up. And Jesus is like, no, dummies. This is Joel's translation. But if it's no, guys, he's dead. But then he says, but for your sake, I'm glad that he has, and I'm glad that you're going to be able to see this. And so in a way, as this, even as to go back to the previous stories, he was healing this woman. Can you imagine being Jairus, her father, saying, okay, this is great. I'm glad she healed, but my daughter is dead. Can we go? Can we move on? But all the while, Jesus was just waiting to show them something greater here. Verse 25. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl arose. And the report of this went through all that district. The last big point that's in your bulletin is, regardless of the past, things are made new when they meet Jesus. Regardless of the past, things are made new when they meet Jesus. You all can tell most of you have been in church for a long time. But this story did not surprise you. That you knew that Jesus was going to come through. That you knew that he was going to raise her up from the dead. But let's not skip over that. Like I said, many of us have even probably been in a funeral in this very building, or all of us have been to a funeral of loved ones, and we have seen somebody, and this little girl was dead. Her heart wasn't beating. Her lungs weren't breathing. There was no activity in her brain. She wasn't running around like she was a few days before then, but she was dead. And Jesus came in and he said, get up, my child. And he grabbed her hand and she rose. So tell me once again, what do you think? What is it in your life that you are still doubting God about? Are you doubting God that he can't reach somebody even though he's reached billions of people with his love? Are you doubting that he can't heal even though he's literally brought people up from the dead? Are you doubting that he isn't rich enough to provide for your next bills even though he owns cattle on 1,000 hills? What is it? You say, God, I don't know if you can do this. This is crazy. God, she said, just wait. You ain't seen nothing yet. We're going to get up here and sing one more song. Invite the band up here.